Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, and I manage the SAGE Research Methods community. I'm pleased to be joined today by Julianne Cheek and Elise Obi, who are co-authors of this book on research design. But before we begin our conversation, if you are new to our community, this is a blog focused on everything to do with designing, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, sharing results in all different kinds of ways, and teaching and learning, so that whether new researchers come to us or experienced researchers, there are opportunities for everyone to learn something new. And we certainly hope that that will be your experience here as we move into discussing Chapter 6. But do you want to just first briefly introduce yourselves?
Just to say that I'm Julianne Cheek. I'm a professor at Østfold University College in Norway, and as Janet said, one of the authors of the book.
And I am Elise Obi, the other author of the book, and I work at Christiania University College, also in Norway.
So you begin the discussion for Chapter 6, talking about qualitative approaches and the series of decisions that you need to make, and the form that a specific qualitative method takes results from a series of interconnected considerations about how to obtain the data that you'll need to address the research questions. So in this discussion, we'll use an example of qualitative research interviews to explore these different choices. So why don't you begin by talking about how the level of structure plays into qualitative interviews?
Yeah, so as you said, Janet, this podcast is about actually putting the methods into practice, but I need to reiterate a point we've been making through all the other podcasts, that we can only do this when we've done the thinking about why we've chosen a qualitative method in the first place, or approach in the first place, and why interviews are a suitable method. So that's taken for granted that we've done that thinking. So, okay, we have decided that a qualitative interview is the way to get the information we need to answer our research question. So that's our starting point. All that thinking has been done. So yes, one of the things we're going to have to think about is how structured will our interview be? And what do I mean, how structured will our interview be? Well, we are all going to sit down and work out what we are going to talk with people about. And I use talk with people about in terms of a qualitative interview because it is more an interview. That's what Steiner-Kavala and Sven Brinkmann refer this to, an interview. It's where we are sharing and exchanging ideas in this interview. So one of the ways that an interview can be structured is it can be a fully structured or closed interview. And this is where I would develop 10, 12 maybe questions. I would write them down and I would read out each question exactly the same. If I was interviewing you, Janet, you would get the 12 questions with the wording in the same order. No matter what you reply to each one, I would then go on to the next one, and that's what we would do. And then I would interview Elisa, and I would do exactly the same thing. So it is a closed interview from the point of view in that we are discussing those questions in that way, and that's it. Now, that type of interview is not used hardly at all or ever in qualitative research, mainly only to collect demographic data. But the reason for that is, if we remember our discussion of qualitative research, we are after getting at people's perceptions, experiences, and understandings. So it's important that we allow people to talk about the things that are important and meaningful for them, all right, not just the things that we have directed that they will talk about. So the other type of interview structures that are possible and which are used in qualitative inquiry are, there is completely open structure where I will start with a statement such as, you recently moved from home to hospital to nursing home. Can you tell me about that experience? That's an example of an open interview. And then the person would start talking. And then as they talk, you would ask questions about what they were talking about. So, oh, that was an interesting point, Janet. Tell me more about why you thought that way at that point of time. What I'm actually doing is, rather than having a set of 10 or 12 set questions, I'm starting with an opening statement, and then I am using questions which we refer to as probes. I am probing what you reply. So what you reply is framing the way that the interview develops. These are, as I said, called open or unstructured interviews. For most people who haven't done much qualitative inquiry, they find this type of interviewing fairly difficult. It's a little bit frightening in some ways to go in with one statement and then to just follow what the person says. But with practice and with experience, these can be very rewarding and very rich interviews. Remember that the purpose of the qualitative research is to get in-depth, rich information about whatever it is we need to know about. So this is a good way of doing it. However, another way of interviewing in qualitative research that is very common is using what we call semi-structured interviews. And as the name suggests, it's an interview with a semi-structure. So what I might do in a semi-structured interview is I might have some areas that I want to know something about. I've worked out these are my lines of inquiry related to whatever it is I want to know. And then I might have 1 or 2 questions written down about those. And then I let the person talk. And as they're talking, I will use probes. If they take me in a direction I haven't thought about, I will use a probe to explore that direction. I am not tied to the closed structure that I would be if I was doing a totally closed off structured interview. As listeners are probably thinking, yes, I can see that a closed and structured interview would be more the type of oral survey in a more quantitative approach. It would enable me to collect that sort of information. Whereas in qualitative research, because we're after different types of information, and the emphasis is on deep, information-rich data from each person individually, we will have more an open or semi-structured interview. So the structure reflects the purpose and the type of information that we would like to get. And this is the same as if we use other qualitative approaches like observations. If we're using observations, for example, we might have an observation schedule where we are only looking for specific things and tick them off on a sheet. That's the equivalent of a closed interview. And that's all that we will observe for. On the other hand, we might go in and do more an anthropological or ethnographic type study where we are actually observing in situ, in the social context, what happens. And we are looking for certain things, but not exact things and only those exact things. So this idea of structure doesn't only apply to interviews, it applies to observations, and it also applies to textual analysis, which is also used in qualitative inquiry, in that when I analyze a text, such as an advertisement or a newspaper article or whatever it is, or a painting or whatever I might be using, am I only looking for specific things, or am I looking for things related to areas, and I've got the opportunity to probe around as I'm reading and as I'm looking at it? So structure is very important and will affect the richness and depth of the information that you get in your qualitative inquiry.
Right. So it also, provide, it seems like one of the considerations is, how much sort of continuity do you want across your set of interviews or observations? Do you want to have everyone answer certain questions or speak to certain topics, but then have more of a variety of follow-ups? So that would kind of fall into that semi-structured area where you might say, well, I want to make sure that everyone talks about their mother and their earliest school experience. Beyond that, we'll go into all sorts of, we might go into other directions, but I want to make sure that I cover these particular topics with with everyone. So you know, I think that the you know, thinking about it, you know, as a continuum, and you know, perhaps even mixing different styles within one interview, you know, allows you flexibility.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is it's important to remember what we're trying to get out of the interviews.
Right.
And that is we're trying to get rich information. And so what we're going to do is we're going to develop themes that emerge from those interviews across. And so it's not like a closed interview where I need to know about that specific variable, that specific variable, that specific variable.
Mhm.
It's about, I've got, as you said, I've got areas that I want to know something about from everyone. But within those areas, I want to know what they want to tell me they think is important,
Mhm.
what their experience was, not about aspects of what I've predetermined I want to know about. And that's that inductivity that we've talked about as being a hallmark of qualitative inquiry.
And I think, you know, one of the things that's interesting to me as well about this is that you know, as you mentioned, different forms, interviews, observations, text analysis using documents and visuals and things like that. But with the interviews and observations, there's a little bit of overlap there, because if you're interviewing me, you might also be observing me. And you might also be observing my setting or my you know, environment. So, you know, these kinds of questions might have a variety of considerations.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because qualitative research is socially situated research. Okay, it doesn't try to remove context, it puts context in. The social context is very important in the research. And so one of the things that people will need to think about when designing their research is, how do they do that? Like, are they going to write field notes that accompany the interviews? Or are they going to interview and collect demographics? And are they going to, in their interview, after the interview, just make a small observations or memos about participants seem to get agitated when we talked about this, that was, you know, so there's a lot to think about in interviews. Or are we just going to do a straight interview, which is more what happens if, for example, we're doing digital interviews, because we tend to remove some of the context in the social setting. I mean, the digital world is a social setting in its own right, but it's a very different social setting than if you're interviewing me in a particular setting at a particular place. And that raises an important consideration as well. Just bouncing off your question a bit, where you interview someone is important to think about. People don't think about that so much, but where are you going to interview them? Because where you interview can affect how they tend to answer the questions. Like, will it be in their home? Will it be at their place of work? These things can matter, and who else is present during the interview can matter as well. So these are all considerations. Okay, we're getting off structure a bit, but this is really important. Yes. You know, it's about seeing the interview as the whole event. Okay, and putting the boundaries around, right, what you are and are not going to collect in that interview. You're definitely going to collect some demographic data, you know, and other things like that. What are you going to collect? Why? And what are you going to do with it is really important as well.
So another big consideration is, are you going to do one-to-one interviews with individuals, or use some kind of a group interview or a focus group? So perhaps you could talk a little bit about how those are differentiated.
Yeah, well, an individual interview is your classic in-depth interview, one-on-one. You and I would be sitting having a interview together. I would be asking you questions, you would be answering them, you would be the only person present. The group interviews, the most commonly used interview that involves more than one person being present, are focus groups. Focus groups are a specific type of interview where I get a group of people together that know something about the topic of interest, of course. So they are what we call in qualitative research information rich. They're information rich in terms of what I'm trying to find something about. I put them in a group, and I put them in the group because I'm interested in getting information arising from the interactions between those people. And I'm thinking that having those interactions in some way is going to give me some type of information that I need more than perhaps the individual interview will. The trade-off, of course, is that if you do an individual interview, and as its name suggests, an in-depth individual interview, and I'm going like that, you're going to go down into things more deeply with that person, and you're going to get richer information from that person. The advantage of the group is that what you are, for some reason, interested in is the interaction between the people in the group. And so you have decided that the interaction is a trade-off against the depth from each person. So once again, there is no right or wrong in this. It's about what do you need to know about, what trade-offs are you going to make, etc. And sometimes it can just be a feasibility matter, like you can't get a group together. You can, for some reason or whatever, and so you decide that you will go with some individual interviews. I've seen some studies too where they have individually interviewed some people and use focus groups as well, but that will need some thinking about how you're going to analyze that, and also about the rationale for doing so. But Elisa, you used focus groups in your study, didn't you? Why did you use focus groups rather than an individual study? An individual interview, yeah.
Well, the study you're referring to is I did in my master's.
Yes.
I wanted to know how people in the higher education sector understood certain words that were used to define what this higher education was supposed to achieve. Why are we doing higher education? And there were some words used there about what we were supposed to achieve, and I wanted to know how people understood those words. So qualitative approach would be the best way to achieve that type of knowledge. And then I decided to do focus groups because I wanted to see how different groups of people working within the higher education sector, like I put this one focus group of professors, one focus group of PhD students, one focus group with admin people who worked with research within the higher education sector. And I wanted to know how they discuss these words and the meaning of these words as a group, more than what individuals, like their individual opinions. I wanted to listen to and be a part of a discussion in these different types of groups of people working in the higher education sector. And so that's why I used focus groups. And then I learned how they reacted to each other's responses more than I learned what their individual opinions were. Yep.
Which related to your research question, focusing on an organizational level more so than on specific individuals.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think most people, when they're thinking about doing interviews, the first question, so to speak, on their minds is, what are the questions I'm going to ask? Where clearly, as we said in the beginning, these are interconnected decisions, but we have thinking about the structure, kind of the framework for it, thinking about, whether it will be individuals or more than one person. And so now we have the question of, what are you going to ask the participants in the interview? So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that this is one that people find deceptively simple and find that it's anything but. Okay, asking a good interview question and a relevant interview question is a work of art, actually, for qualitative research. So I think the first thing that people need to think about is go back to your research question and problem. What is it that you're trying to find out about? What types of things do you need to know about? And make a list of those. Just make a list of what are the areas of things I need to know something about. We're not trying to make them into questions. We're not trying to do anything at this stage. We're identifying areas that are important, that are going to help build this overall picture, which is going to produce an answer or actually produce some understanding of the problem that I'm trying to address in my research. And it's not my words, but it's other researchers' words. They call these lines of inquiry. So what are going to be my lines of inquiry? The areas that I'm interested in knowing something about from everyone, right? So I might want to know something from everyone about how is work organized in this place? How do different groups react to the organization of work in that place? I'm only in areas, I haven't got research questions as such specifically related to my overall thing necessarily, but so notion of work, organization of work, etc. Broad areas, identify your lines of inquiry. And one of the key things is not to have too many areas or lines of inquiry, because what you're going to do is develop questions related to each of those lines of inquiry. So then once you've identified, I think some people say 4 to 5, there's no magic number, there's no thing, but they're giving you an idea. If you have 20 lines of inquiry, for example, and you attach 2 questions to each, you've got 40 questions. The average interview goes 60 minutes. That means you've got 1 minute per question. I don't think you're going to get in-depth, rich information. So think of it that way, right? I'm trying to get in-depth, rich information. So what are the key areas I want to know something about, my lines of inquiry? And then the next question you need to ask yourself is, what are the areas within this line of inquiry that I want to know something about? And so consequently, that might start forming into the specific research questions that give the semi-structure to your interview. And then as the interview progresses, you will ask more questions in the form of probes that you haven't prepared before the interview, but which come up during the interview. So first of all, giving the interview some sort of shape with lines of inquiry. Under those lines of inquiry, writing out the questions that you want to ask related to those lines of inquiry. And then during the interview or focus group, or if you're using a focus group, when people say things, following up with questions we call probes, because we are responding to what they're saying and asking them questions about that. Classic probes are, that was interesting. Tell me what you meant when you said, I felt lonely, or tell me, why did you mention that? Why was that so significant for you? These are the examples of probe questions, and we don't know what they're going to be ahead because we don't know exactly what people are going to say. So you tend to go in with your areas determined, your questions underneath those areas, and then you will probe those areas. Again, best way to get a handle on this, if you're just starting off in this and you haven't designed an interview before for qualitative research, is ask some of the researchers who have done qualitative research, can you have a look at their interview guide? Can you have a look at it? And then work backwards on that interview and think, what were the lines of inquiry? What were the questions related to that lines of inquiry? Okay, and then maybe interview the person and say, this is what I figured these were the areas you were interested in, and these were the questions. Is that right? So back going over the material. I think that so often we don't use the resources we have to learn from, and everyone's, there are many researchers sitting around with fantastic interview guides that have never been analyzed in that way, or never used to guide someone else in developing their own guide in that way, even though it might be on an entirely different topic.
So then, of course, we can't do interviews unless we have participants. So who will you interview? How do researchers figure that out?
Well, the principle in qualitative inquiry is that the person that I interview needs to know something about what I want to know about. Okay, that's self-evident. But the word that's used is information-rich people. So let's think about that study that I told you that I did, where we studied older person is at home, falls over, breaks hip, goes into hospital unexpectedly, and then finds out they're not going home again because they can't go home because the hip has altered so many things, etc. And they have to go into a nursing home. So I need to think about what is it that I want to know about that. So I need to work out my question. And so I might want to focus on people actually undergoing that transition, the older person and their significant others. So who would I interview? Who would be information rich? It would be the older people and their significant others, okay, that I would want to focus on in that study. In a different study about that, I might want to focus on nurses and doctors and health workers who are involved in developing this transition for someone. But that's not what my study is about. My study is about what's it like for people actually undergoing that transition. And so the information rich people are the people that are undergoing it or have undergone it, both the older person and the significant others that have been involved with them during that transition. So that's the first thing. Who can tell me in depth about whatever it is that I want to know, not what I might want to hear or not what I've decided is the answer, but what their experience was. And so to tell me about their experience, they need to have had the experience and need to have had it reasonably recently. So that's the first thing. The next thing that you have to decide there is you have to make some decisions about how you approach these people, what you tell them about the study, etc., etc. And the other question that you will have to decide once you've identified potential groups of information-rich people that might be possible to single interview or focus group or whatever you've decided you're going to do, is how many of these people will you have in your study? Okay, which I think is, we're moving into another question, but it doesn't matter, it's related. And that is a question that is a difficult one in qualitative inquiry, because in more quantitative inquiry, we have statistics and probability to help us with that answer, depending on what we want to be able to say with some form of certainty. But that's not the case in qualitative research. So what we have to think about is, when do I have the same sorts of ideas coming up in interviews? Might be different examples of it, but am I fairly confident that I'm getting the same sort of ideas coming out? Might take a different form, but, you know, for example, people say it was rushed, or I didn't get the support I needed, or I felt very stressed, it put strain on the family. So those sorts of things, okay, if they're starting to come out across most of the interviews, and people after my 15th interview or my 20th interview or my 10th interview, depending how information rich my sample is, okay, I might actually be at the point where I feel I've got a pretty good picture of this. I've got a lot of in-depth information. So how many people I interview is more a product of the richness of the information I get, because I could interview 50 people and have very thin information, right? It's the richness of the information, and also how information rich those people are. Kirsty Molterad talks about information power of the sample. Like, if you have people in your sample who are very information rich, you will probably need less of them. Okay. Whereas if you've got people who are not so information rich, you will probably need more of them. So the answer to that is that I can't give you a number. I can give you some principles, and you will make decisions as you go. That's part of the development of the research as it goes. And it's very important, if it's your first set of interviews or focus groups, that you work with an experienced qualitative inquirer who can mentor through that process. And in the book, we try to talk about these things in an introductory way, give some exercises, activities, etc., for people to think about as well, to help you with some of these issues, because it's frustrating not to be able to give you a number, but we can't give you a number.
Right, right. So, you know, we've talked about some kind of specific principles particularly with interviews. So does the same kind of thinking apply to other types of qualitative methods for collecting data?
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me, my throat is starting to go, too much talking. Okay, I'll just take a sip of coffee. In observations, we've already talked about, will your observations be structured? You know, these are ones, classic ones is where you sit behind a mirror, a mirrored wall, two-way mirror, and you observe for set things. Will they be more in context and open? Or will you have a schedule of things that you are actually looking for? So structure is principle in observations and texts. Another thing is, what observations will you make? Who will you observe is the next thing. Like, who are you actually going to observe? Where are you going to observe them? Why are you observing those people? Again, it must be because what you are going to observe and those people doing is information rich in some way to help you answer your research question. So, for example, if I was observing meal times in a family, and this is an example that we give in the book, I would go and observe them at a mealtime. Okay, I would go and actually try to observe those meal times. There's been some classic observational studies done, like the famous Swedish one in the kitchen, etc., etc. So there's lots of examples of that. So you're going to have to decide, where do you observe people? What do you observe? Who do you observe? Okay, and what do you observe for? So it's same sorts of principles, same in text. Which documents are you going to analyze? Why those documents? How many of them? Same principles. So I think it's quite possible to extrapolate the 5 questions that we ask about interviews: how structured, what will you ask, who will you ask, how many will you ask, etc., etc., over to observations and over to text. They'll be slightly different, of course, but the same principles apply.
Is there anything else that you want to add from chapter 6?
No, just to say that what we focused on was, we tried to focus on the principles and the thinking that sits behind the data collection. And that was important to do, because often people think that interviews are, I write down 5 things I'm going to ask people, I run out and ask them, and I've done my interviews. We've even had students come, or some have come to me and said, I've written down the questions that I want to ask. This is at our first supervision meeting. And I say, well, can we take a step back? What is it that you're studying? And they struggle to articulate that. And what that tells me is that these probably aren't the questions that they need to ask. The first thing they need to do is figure out what they're wanting to know about and what they'll need to know that. And then they can start developing their questions. And then when you know that, you can start asking yourself this level of thinking: structure, who, when, where, how long, etc., etc. So it's a cascade, again, within research design, of a whole series of thinking-based decisions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Anything else you want to add, Elise?
No, just that feasibility also needs to be taken into consideration. Okay, so you can have this perfect plan of who to ask and where to interview them, but then if that plan includes a lot of travel and a lot of costs, then maybe it's not feasible. So I think thinking about allowing feasibility to be part of your decision making when you're making all these choices is important too, because if you don't, then maybe the research will never be done.
Yeah, feasibility, absolutely right. And feasibility is in here. And as Elisa says, it's at every part. And that was why in our very first podcast, we said that one of the facets of research design is that feasibility, because it's no good, as Elisa says, having the perfect question and the perfect set of interview schedules, but I can't get to the interviews because I've got to interview people in 55 countries and I want to observe them in context. Nice project if you can get funding for it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I hope for those who are viewing this discussion, this gives you something more to think about as you're reading chapter 6.